that Norke's talk was an amazing introduction to our next panel. So our next panel is Beyond Liberal Feminism, the Challenge of Women's Grassroots Power for Transformation. And we've got three amazing panelists, so I'm just going to quickly read short bios of each of them, and then we can get into their introductions. So I'll start with Jackie Kopp, who is an academic activist, a professor emeritus in the sociology department of Wits, and an honorary research professor in SWAP. Samantha Hargreaves, who is the founder and director of the Women African Alliance, which launched in 2013, and works in 12 countries across Africa to expose the gendered impacts and mechanics of patriarchal extractivist development model. They also advance development alternatives from the perspective of the majority of peasant and working class women in Africa. Samantha has a long history of work on land, agrarian, and extractivist terrain. She has previously worked for the National Land Committee and one of its affiliates, and prior to Golden Woman was employed by Action Aid International. She has been involved in and offered solidarity support to various movements of landless people, rural women, and more recently communities and networks fighting against extractive industries. Samantha holds a master's degree in development studies from the University of Wits. And then lastly, we've got Mazibuko Jara, who by his own bio is an activist. So I think we can start with go down the line. So Jackie, do you want to start?
Right, good afternoon everyone. This is a very hard act to follow because that was a really inspiring presentation. But I want to make one point to you. And the point is that the people who contributed the most and have been benefited the least from building a carbon-intense economy in South Africa are the coal workers and people living in mining-affected communities. And I'm going to argue, or try to argue, that they should be the priority in our struggle for climate justice. I was very excited during the Fees Must Fall movement when there emerged a strong, radical black feminism. And I found it exciting because for me it represented a decisive break with the liberal feminism of the past, which simply is content to ask for gender equality. And it also seemed to be a decisive break with the dismissal of feminism as an elitist, white, middle-class woman's concern. But I have come to be a little worried because I believe, and I believe strongly, that a feminism that speaks of women's oppression without challenging capitalism is bound to fail. And I also believe that an environmental or climate justice movement that speaks of the climate crisis without challenging capitalism as the cause, as the driver of the climate crisis through its expansionist logic and the promotion of a green capitalism which tries to resist change through new technology and expanding markets, that is also bound to fail. And this is why I want to argue that we have to look to communities, and particularly the community of Mpumalanga. Because very, very clearly, women living in those communities are the shock absorbers of the climate crisis. They've been subject to various forms of dispossession, not only of land and livelihoods, but of access to clean water and air, to recognition and respect, and importantly for many, many people, daily contact with their ancestors. Because in traditional terms, ancestors are not buried in a remote cemetery that people visit tokenistically once a year. They are buried next to the homestead. And one of the criminal acts of the criminal elite who run the minerals energy complex has been to the removal of ancestral graves. For example, in one community where Samantha's been working, Paula, Glencore, to establish one coal mine, removed 1,000 graves. So these people have been the subject of incredible hardship and social dislocation. And it's women who, because of the climate crisis, have to work harder in order to stretch a wage or a social grant further, in cultivating degraded land, in walking further to get clean water, in caring for the sick and people damaged by the polluted air and water. But women are not simply the shock absorbers, black working class women. Women also are at the forefront of what are often dismissed as service delivery protests, but are actually protests about environmental justice, protests about the lack of access to clean air, water, adequate housing, land for subsistence, agriculture, and so on. Women constitute by far the majority of people in these struggles, confronting their dispossession and threats to their health, land, and livelihoods. And the women of, think of the women of Molobeni, for example, which is a struggle against titanium mining, which is a struggle Andrew Benny can talk about. Think of the struggle of the women of Somkeli, again, that Samantha knows very well, or of the Mazibuko that Mazibuko is familiar with. In all of these struggles, women are subject to increasing violence. And this is not a South African phenomenon only. This is part of a global pattern. According to a report in The Guardian, globally, there were 200 environmental women activists killed in 2016. And that's killed. That's not talking about the threats of violence and intimidation that women are subjected to on a daily level. Now, there's a book with a very intriguing title, which I ordered simply because of its title. It's called The Mushroom at the End of the World. And it's by an American anthropologist called Anna Singh. And she says, if we want real change, we must look to non-marketized spaces, the spaces on which capitalism depends. And the black working class women in mining-affected communities that I'm talking about, I think represent two such spaces. Mm-hmm. Firstly, women's unpaid care work in the household subsidizes capital by externalizing the costs of social reproduction. And women's care work, where women are the majority for the environment, they subsidize capital, again, because much environmental damage represents the externalization of environmental costs. And these two aspects of care work are connected, because the explanation of women's preponderance in environmental struggles doesn't lie in any essential connection to nature, but in the gender division of labor. At the same time, the care work that women do outside the market in these two specific spaces, the household and the environment, they contain a transformative potential. And I'm thinking of collective non-marketized relationships such as cooperatives, which are developing in a lot of these communities, often in embryonic and clumsy forms, sewing co-ops, bulk buying, seed saving, shared childcare, talk of people's restaurants, all point to an alternative society of the concrete kind, as Vish emphasized in his review of Kopek's extraordinary struggle of yesterday. These are the building blocks of eco-socialism. It's largely women who are practicing food sovereignty, which includes working with nature through agroecology instead of the reliance of harmful pesticides and chemicals in industrial agriculture, as Vanessa pointed out this morning. What I'm trying to point to is that these women represent a feminist eco-socialism. Without claiming that identity, without necessarily using that language, they are providing a new narrative of relations with nature, which is based on cooperation rather than competition and dominance, a narrative which sees nature not simply as a sink for our waste products or a source for economic activity. They're promoting a new narrative of caring social relations and representing an alternative to the intense individualism of neoliberalism. But what I don't want to give the impression that this is a rosy or easy picture, because these communities are desperately poor. And in many of them, there's a very complex relationship to coal because of a widespread dependence on coal. Because the coal industry represents at least the possibility of jobs, even if they are small temporary contract jobs. And it also represents, coal workers represent a market for the many women who depend on informal sector activities for their survival. So it's a complex situation, but what I think we have to confront right now, and it's a painful and difficult fact, these women are excluded from the current debates about a just transition. There's intense debate around the concept. There's a very alarming appropriation of it by powerful forces. It's being shrugged to a minimized conception of simply marketized change to a new energy regime. And it's losing the transformative potential that Labour promoted when it brought the concept to this country after when it was accepted in Cancun in 2010. And this is one of the tragic things we have to confront, that Labour is not engaging with these communities, and they are very dependent on the work of people like Samantha and organizations such as WOMAN, which you'll talk about, I hope, and the Women's Movement Assembly, and the work of the Center for Environmental Rights, and the kind of alliances which are developing, which are trying to build on these women's strength and how they are pointing. They are providing us with an embryonic kind of compass to an eco-socialist future. We have much to learn from them, and I think they have to be the priority in all the work we do. Thank you.
Hi everyone. So I'm feeling very tired. I'm trying to muster a lot of energy, but so I thought I want to tell a story today. And it's really a story that actually talks about liberal feminism and its contents and what it means for women's organizing versus a much more radical politics, transformatory politics from below. And that's a little bit the story of women. So what is WOMAN? WOMAN is an African alliance. We are present at this time in 11 countries across the continent, East, West, and Southern Africa. Our primary focus is to supporting women's organizing and movement building, and it's to challenge what we call destructive extractivism. So this embraces mining, oil, gas, large energy, and big infrastructure. Extractors would cover industrial agriculture, industrial fisheries, industrial forests, but we don't enter that terrain at all. But we think about how this resource extraction is happening through the lens of extractivism and extractivist capitalism. That extractivist capitalism basically sees, as Jackie points out, natural resources as a source or an input for production and the basis for massive profiteering. Obviously, adjunct to that is the exploitation of cheap labor. So we wanted to work on this terrain, but we wanted to work with women specifically. And this was because women are really bearing the brunt of an extractivist development model. So women living in rural communities that are suffering large-scale mining projects like the Inga Dam in the DRC, or a large gold mine in Burkina Faso, or a coal-fired power station in Senegal, because of the division of labor, because of the roles that are assigned to women in these communities, they carry the costs, these externalized costs that Jackie talks about. And that was the rationale for entering work on extractivism, working with affected women. I'm going to come back to, it's not just that women carry the burden of impact, but that women offer the potential. Working class peasant women offer the potential and the lodestar for what we should be working towards. So when Women started building, which was in 2012, we launched in October 2013, we had this wonderful idea that we would work with women's rights organizations and movements across the continent. And we would bring this really important political question to women's rights organizations and movements. We assumed that there was a vibrant women's movement in at least some African countries. And I'm afraid all of our assumptions were absolutely wrong. So what did we discover? We discovered women's rights organizations, sure, most of them urban-based, most of them driven by NGOs, most of them middle class in their interests and agenda. We discovered women's rights organizations and networks that were deeply affiliated to political parties. So they were almost embroiled in the political party system. And so the idea of independent organizing and a much more radical agenda was off the cards for these organizations. What were they working on? And this is what I'm saying, I'm talking historically, but it's still the reality to this day. We found women's rights organizations and networks working on traditional women's rights issues. So there I would be referring to violence against women or women's health, very rarely on reproductive rights because that's just too dangerous in this context, too controversial to be talking about abortion. We found a huge tendency of work on women's political participation. So it was really around getting women into local government, training women to stand for elections and get into national government. So this was what we encountered. We very rarely found women's organizations working on land and agrarian reform. There are exceptions. In Zimbabwe, Women in Land Zimbabwe, Jackie's mentioned Rural Women's Assembly. So Rural Women's Assembly works in Southern Africa with peasant women, women farmers, organizing women farmers to assert perspectives around land and food from a feminist perspective. So that's what we discovered. We also discovered that the gender mainstreaming dimension, so working to advance women's interests in current frameworks, whether those be economic development models or policies or laws relating to land reform, a lot of the orientation was working within the system, working within the model. And that's a legacy that comes from the United Nations, from 1995, from the work of academics that have talked about the need to gender mainstream. So you bring women's issues and gender issues into the mainstream, so into the mainstream ways of thinking and doing development. So that was the legacy that we're sitting with on this continent. There are lots of small groups in communities across the continent where women are organizing themselves for day-to-day survival. It's savings groups, it's church groups, it's religious groups in Islamic communities, it is women producing collectively or doing shared labor. But that organizing was very, very localized and very important work, but it wasn't hooked up into networks or movements of women in communities struggling for justice. So we had to divert course. And so we started working with organizations. Unfortunately, they're mainly NGOs. But we found organizations that aligned with us politically, that were committed to supporting women's organizing and movement building from a more radical perspective. And I think we've learned a lot from this process because we've been supporting, through partners and allies, women's organizing and movement building in specific resistances across the continent. Those are resistances against coal extraction, coal-fired power, big dams, large mines, big infrastructure like oil pipelines. So this is the terrain of struggle. It's generally in the rural context. And with partners and allies, we've been able to deepen women's organizing and movement building in these sites of resistance. It's over 40 across 11 countries. We're having to rationalize it's just been overwhelmingly demanding, and if we want to really deepen the organizing and movement building work, we're going to have to get a little bit more focus. But the work that we've been doing is supporting women's organizing from below, from the grassroots. So we've been supporting feminist schools at the local, national, and Pan-African level, supporting women research their own lives, their own context through feminist participatory action research as the basis for action, supporting solidarity exchanges between communities, building out with other more radical organizations on the continent, platforms like the Thematic Social Forum on Mining and the Extractivist Economy, which we see as points of convergence for many struggles across the continent. But what have we learned and what have we observed and how have we been guided in our theoretical concepts, but also our approaches to supporting organizing and movement building? We found in communities, in these nodes of resistance, there is such clarity in the no, in people, in women in these communities saying no to these large projects. That stands contrary to a lot of the NGOs, and we're consistently fighting the NGOs who are trying to divert very clear struggles of resistance to, oh no, but you can't say no, but you can draw on this policy framework, or you could draw down corporate social responsibility benefits. And so when you look at the political positions and the battles that women are fighting in these communities as part of a wider community struggle, there is such political certainty, there are such radical positions. So when you put that against the NGO, women's organizations and movements that are doing it in the mainstream with such watered down weak politics, we found it extremely inspiring. What's been very interesting to us is when we started building, we adopted a feminist perspective. So we wanted to support women's organizing and movement building, to challenge patriarchy, but also to challenge capitalism, which we saw as a source of oppression for women. What has happened is that through our work with women in communities across the continent, we've shifted our political analysis. So we've moved very clearly into a strong eco-feminist orientation, which Jackie has referred to. And so because the front line of struggle for these communities is around defending land, defending natural resources, defending their water bodies, defending their very ability to survive, ecology was a critical dimension here. So we had to bring in ecology, we brought in feminist analysis, so patriarchy, really understanding how patriarchy intersects with capitalism and capitalism's very specific relationship to an exploitation of natural resources. And so women in communities and their struggles, their defiance, has really guided how we are seeing extractivism and the logic of extractivism on the continent. The last thing that I just want to point to is that our thinking is that it's not, women are not at the epicenter of resistance just because they carry the burden of impact. Like Jackie was saying, the division of labor in communities across the continent repeats what we see here. It's where women are taking responsibility for reproduction, for the care of the family and the community. What that means is they are the ones producing the food and processing and putting the food on the table. They are the ones that have to walk hours where there is pollution of water bodies to fetch water, clean water, literally hours. They are the ones that have to walk further, often in dangerous conditions, just to get firewood. So it's because of the division of labor, like Jackie says, that women have a very different positionality in relation to the environment, to nature, and to other people because of their care role. And so just as Jackie says, I think women in many of the communities we're linked to in struggle, because of the way that they live every day, the way that they're producing, the way they are taking care of humanity, the way they are taking care of natural resources, the very basis of their survival, tells us a lot about how we should be living. And so we feel an ecofeminist perspective built from below through women in actual resistance, defending nature, defending against the encroachments of capital, offer us the guidance, the lodestar for where we should be moving as humanity collectively. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Chair. If I could sing, I would lead a song. We've been sitting all day without a song or a poem, but anyway, let's see if before the end of the conference there's a comrade who can rise to the challenge of singing. Now, to the topic. A lot of some of the conceptual and strategic stuff has been covered by both Jackie and Samantha. Whilst I'll still grapple with it, but I'll put a different angle to it. The first point I'd like to make is that we must reclaim the meaning of feminism. This is quite crucial, particularly in the context where at this moment in our history there's a heightened awareness about male violence towards women. But also, as much as there is that heightened awareness, there is also a very resilient male denialism. It coexists with this heightened awareness. If social media or some of the stuff on public radio is anything to go by, where you hear a sustained effort and attempt to say, actually men are also abused and so on, in ways that actually displace the centrality of gender oppression. But also, the other reason we have to reclaim the meaning of feminism is because almost every grouping of people that works with women claims to be feminist in very problematic ways, without actually locating that meaning of feminism within a perspective that seeks to radically uproot the foundations of oppression. But also, in our society, the reassertion of a particular meaning of feminism has to grapple with the fact that the particular path of capitalist development that we have over some 150, 250 years, as Jackie was saying, has been subsidized by the unpaid labor of women. And that subsidy continues even in hidden forms, even if now women, much more than before, are integrated in perverse ways into the mainstream economy. But still, what we see in this society is quite a deep crisis about the conditions of producing society, the notions of social care, and so on that Samantha was referring to. So this is very crucial for me because if we do not reassert a radical perspective of feminism, what we lose is the notion of feminism, central in it being the liberation of women from their oppression as a gender. That's absolutely crucial. That's crucial also in a sense where we've seen the challenge from women leading to organizations appropriating gender language just to perpetuate male domination in organizations. But it's not just the oppression of women from a gender perspective. What is also crucial, as I said, a radical perspective on feminism would be what in the 70s and 80s got consolidated into the perspective of characterizing that oppression as triple oppression, and then taking it to what Jackie is referring to as understanding the centrality of class, but also the centrality of race in the positionality of the majority of women. So for me, that's the first point I'd like to make, a radical reclamation of the meaning of feminism that's informed by by the realities of where we are as a society. The second point I'd like to make is part of the denialism or trying to minimize what feminism is about is a sustained discourse that at times continues to say feminism is a Western phenomenon. And as the left, or even feminists generally, people have not yet succeeded to roll back that perspective. And yet there are real concrete identities, expressions and struggles of women against oppression that go back for millennia, that have actually put forward to us material on African feminisms that we have not really grappled with, we have not really theorized. The idioms. So in research that we did a while back, when we looked at a total of 3,000 women in Kastamahuk, in Rabatabama and Msinga, there was a very powerful constant refrain. Like the sons of this village, we too have a right to land. So what you find in that kind of idiom is an expression of endogenous feminism that grapples with both culture as well as the discourse of constitutional rights. Now, if we continue to leave the notion of feminism as being Western, as being Northern, what we lose out is the power of that kind of idiom as a mobilizing force, because then feminism becomes something that is just theoretical, that is just conceptual, but not as a lived strategy and reality that women over millennia have built. As much as I've said this, what is also important about reasserting an African notion of feminism is the seduction of culture and heritage from a conservative standpoint today. If you look at the voices of young women that support the reed dance, that support virginity testing, you can see that there's a void, there's a yearning for meaning, there's a yearning for something to give meaning in a society that has been emptied out by neoliberalism. And in that space, radical feminists and the broad left have not been able to grapple with that seduction of culture and heritage that leads people in conservative directions. And of course, within that seduction of heritage and culture, what also gets lost are progressive impulses which women had actually fought for and introduced into African cultures. Nomalanga Mkhize does quite a fascinating study of cases of violence against women in the 1880s and 1890s in Timberland. Basically, these cases are instigated by the fact that the women were going outside of the marital relationship to have sexual relationships beyond marriage. And what she picks up in the court cases that she studies is actually women reasserting forms of sexuality that colonialism was beginning to confine by that point in time. So that kind of understanding of agents of women gets lost if we leave a space of heritage and culture to conservative forces. So I'm not saying that space of heritage and culture we must give up on it. But I'm saying we are failing to build the tools that connect a long history of African feminisms in a way that connects with that and in a way that can challenge the dominance of conservative notions. To take it further, my third point is then that we need, as Jackie was saying, a feminism that's conscious of class. I want to take it further by saying the task for us then is grappling with how do we build a cadre of socialist feminists. The women Jackie talks about leading the drama of public protest. How do we use their ability to come out into the streets into building a socialist consciousness in a deliberate way, such that people go beyond protest, but also grapple with a critical understanding of capitalism, but also a feminist eco-socialist strategy, as Samantha was saying. In this regard, then, what is going to be crucial is to organize women as women. And it is interesting that from the shutdown last year to the marches after Unene was killed, we've seen women coming out and asserting their identity as women and being unapologetic about it. That's quite crucial. There have been moments of that in our history. But beyond that, organizing women as feminists. Now, in that regard, there are different varieties that have emerged in the mass mobilizations we've seen in this regard. But I would add, organizing around the pillar or the pole or the vision of eco-socialism is quite absent in the mobilizations we are seeing. But that organization of women as feminists around an eco-socialist pillar is not going to be possible without a sustained rebuilding of a broader mass movement. That broader mass movement has to be different from mass movements of the past that were not necessarily deliberately consciously feminist, not deliberately building a feminist politics. So there is some work to do there. And we do not have the resources as we have of the past in terms of a mass number of activists and so on, who could grapple with phenomena, who could carry the weight of building organization. That's not necessarily a call to despair, but it's just to underline the amount of work we have to do in this regard. Just to go back to this point about feminist eco-socialism, there's a point I forgot, which both Jackie and Samantha touched on: social care, livelihood, survival. Now, in this era of quite a sustained crisis of capitalism, which is no longer going to provide jobs for the large majority, even those jobs are not going to be well paid, is there not a possibility, is there not a different logic that is emerging in these survivalist activities? Can we just subject those survivalist activities to just being survivalist? Is it not possible to use the framework of the solidarity economy to actually work out other meanings, other possibilities? So, for example, the production of value. Now, the value that's produced in the survivalist strategies may be useful for capital, but actually it's much more useful and much more meaningful for those who are engaged in it. How do we build around that in ways that can begin to meet the social needs of communities? Of course, we're still very far from building a critical mass in that regard, but I think there's some work to imagine a prefigurative, regenerative politics around a feminist socialist perspective that works from that reality of seeking to transform this type of the English is running away. The last point I want to make is about then the positionality of men in rebuilding a feminist eco-socialist trust in society. Now, where you see male activism on women's issues, particularly male violence against women, you've seen a discourse that has already displaced the centrality of gender oppression, where gender becomes the equating of men and women, as if men are equally oppressed, as if men are not oppressors. And in fact, to the extreme, that discourse tends to also depoliticize gender. The task here for us as men in particular, where we have to reclaim that space, because liberal discourses and conservative discourses have this displacing effect, have this depoliticizing effect. That's not necessarily easy, again, because your progressive men are rather few and displaced and quite disorganized. Quite central in that regard is going to be how then men position themselves in rethinking the position of men as oppressors. That notion of men as oppressors is quite absent. And this is not naming and shaming in a way that displaces action, but from a progressive perspective, similar to people committing class suicide. Perhaps there's a progressive thrust that's required about committing gender suicide on the part of men, but on a progressive basis. Thank you.